So the term open space is evocative of a physical open to sky space with myriad variations in form, ownership, use and access. Like their built counterparts, open spaces are essential sites of sustenance, communication, spectacle and association. Can we imagine New York without Central Park, or St. Peter's Basilica without the Piazza? The Egyptian pyramids parted from the desert sands, the Taj Mahal without the river Yamuna, or Venice without its canals. In more quotidian instances, what is a school without its playground, or a settlement without its market square, or a pastoral community without its commons? As designers and urbanists, we are entrusted with the work of shaping physical environments which comprise the built and the unbuilt. So this symposium stems from a curiosity about our comprehension of and commitment to the unbuilt, more specifically open space. American ecologist Aldo Leopold wrote, "To those devoid of imagination, a blank place on a map is a useless waste. To others, the most valuable part." In these 2 days, we look forward to expanding our imaginations as our esteemed panelists discuss open spaces in India through varied lenses of design, planning, law, policy, management and governance. With this introduction, I now invite our principal, Dr. Bhavne, to take the dais and mark the beginning of the symposium. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Salila. On behalf of RVCA Publisher, my management, my faculty, colleagues and students, I extend very warm welcome to distinguished speakers, panelists, speakers from other institutions, distinguished participants from the other institutions, and dear students. This today's symposium starting from today 25th of November and tomorrow the deliberations will continue. Open spaces matters. I think this is the topic which is not a debatable topic. Open spaces do matter. Open spaces in present urban context, if you look at, they are most precious, valuable commodity, scarce commodity, and I would say it's endangered commodity, because people eye at open spaces in the cities, in urban areas from different intentions. The builders, politicians, the NGOs and so on. There are different stakeholders to the open spaces in and around cities and rural areas as well. Say, when we learn town planning at early stages in our bachelor's program, our town planning teachers used to say that yes, 16 to 19% of open spaces are must because they are required to provide the public amenities. So that was the idea given that yes, open spaces are required because of the public amenities to be accommodated. But if you look at the perspective of the people like me who are more technology oriented and deal with subjects like climatic design and so, I always discuss the open spaces in the cities and urban areas as something that has the impact on the microclimate of the city. It can impact the temperature at the local level, the humidity at the local level, wind movement at the local level and so on. But when we talk about the sociologists, he would say that open spaces are must for the healthy living environment, for the health of the people in the society. It is the place where the people mingle, people do it gather for exercise, especially if you look at the importance of these open spaces for the children and the elderly people who understand what is the importance of the open spaces. For economists, will say that yes, it brings the value to your neighborhood. It adds value to your land, your property. So they look at it differently. The people now who are studying the climate change and its impact, we look at the phenomena of urban heat island and things like that. So you'll find that different people have a different perspective and different stake on the issue of the open spaces. I am happy that my colleagues, led by Dr. Salila, thought of organizing a 2-day session, a deliberation called Symposium, and inviting the experts from the areas. We have the people who are architects, we have the landscape architects, we have the urban planner. So you will find that the people from the different diversified fields have come together here to deliberate on the issue. We'll have the likes of architect Mohan Rao, architect Rajesh Renganathan, architect Varna, Dr. Shanmunga Priya, then Professor Paramjit Das, Shweta Baud, Shashidhar Rajesh, Shri M.D. Madhusudan, and Dr. Shashidhar. So all distinguished people who have done remarkable work pertaining to the issues of open spaces and how they have dealt in their projects, how they have valued the open spaces, idea of the open spaces in creating wonderful built environment. So I warmly extend welcome to all the distinguished speakers and all of you to this platform. I am sure that next 2 days are going to be very exciting, and in terms of learning, I think there's a lot of learning exchange is going to happen. So with these few words, I once again welcome and compliment my faculty for organizing such a wonderful and useful symposium. Thank you one and
all. Thanks, sir. Now I invite Jagrati Jain to introduce the speakers and we can start the proceedings.
A very good morning to everyone. So we have 3 speakers today in the panel 1. First is architect Mohan Rao. He heads integrated design, INDÉ, a research-based practice engaged in environmental design, regional planning and landscape architecture, with a strong focus on sustainable practices. His area of engagement includes ecosystem services, climate change, passive design, low-impact development, heritage site interpretation, and traditional knowledge systems. His academic research and practices initiatives are spread across India, China, Africa, Europe, and Latin America. His work has been recognized with several awards, including those instituted by UNESCO, IFLA, HUDCO, and others. Sir, I welcome you on stage.
Thank you. RVCA, Dr. Barney and Salila for this opportunity. Yes, and like the opening address actually mentioned the importance of open space, but more important than its importance is the diversity of views and definitions and imaginations of what this open space does or what it can be. So one way for me to start with the idea of open space is to look at its qualitative aspect. Qualitative not just from an architectural, urban design or visual experience perspective, but from all the other myriad experiences that are actually embedded in what I would rather term as unbuilt spaces. Open spaces is one way of defining a certain quality. In our context, especially in the increasingly urbanized world that we live in, what remains unbuilt or what is deemed as unbuilt actually takes on a much higher importance. And the reason for this differentiation is very, very important, because open spaces are designated through a planning tool, through a design control, through a development mechanism, whereas unbuilt spaces are vastly different. They could have a much deeper roots in the ecological, social, cultural history of a place. So it's even as a nomenclature, it's very, very important to differentiate between the two, because a typical instrument would call anything that does not have a designated land use, such as residential or commercial, simply as open space, which is different from looking at it for its unbuilt qualities. And unbuilt qualities across the landscape, and this is across all traditional societies, though most of my examples are in the Indian context. This is not to say this is limited to our own geography, but you will find this anywhere where humans have occupied territories over the last few millennia. And the meanings, the qualities of the meaning for the different stakeholders, the different ways in which it is used at different times of the day, at different times of the year, are very varying. So it's important to understand that dynamism of the unbuilt spaces as against the fixed quality that you would see in a built space or a defined open space. And needless to say, this does not even require any reinforcement of the embedded qualities that we find in our unbuilt spaces. It is ecological, rooted in cultural belief, which is reinforced by religious and spiritual parameters. And often, as we were discussing earlier in the day, for example, if you were to look at the idea of the sacred forest or Devarakadu as it is defined in lots of geographies, what got to be recognized first? Is it the sacred nature of a certain place, or was it the ecological quality of the space which was then deemed sacred? Becomes actually a moot question. It's not a question of the chicken versus the egg, but in this case both reinforcing each other. And it is to understand this aspect which in turn then supports aspects such as livelihood and the physicality of the culture becomes even more stronger. And these are, though a lot of the examples that we are looking at is spread across fairly rural, semi-rural landscapes, this is very much true of even very dense urban fabrics. Bangalore, Mumbai, Delhi, doesn't matter. What we deem as informal spaces or slums, quote unquote, are actually teeming with these unbuilt spaces with social, ecological and environmental qualities. And going beyond the merely utilitarian, the abstract nature of assigning meanings to these. It could be a very productive landscape that grows innocuously on a roof, or it could be the tradition of celebrating any aspect of this open space. That actually is a very important 2000-year-old tradition, what we are seeing on the left, where every household not just has a tulsi, which is very common across the country, but that tulsi is the adopted daughter who has a name, who is bathed and dressed every single day. This happens among certain social groups in Orissa and North Andhra. So these actually impart very different qualities to the same open space. It is not just religious anymore. It is actually an extension of the social fabric of the larger community. And one of the ways, and what from here on what we are going to be seeing is a few examples of our own work across geographies where we try to interpret the ecological and the traditional knowledge systems that are embedded in landscapes. And does that help us build a Sthala Purana, something that is rooted in a particular ground? This is not a framework that is applicable across the country. every single landscape, every single one of these pieces of land, however small or large it is, comes with its own set of stories, right from the geological history to the mythology to the cultural and the livelihood aspect. And how does one leverage this? This is not about extracting a certain thing or even utilizing that quality, but leveraging it in a way that can actually contribute to the further development. So the critical thing here is to understand that we are not just celebrating something from the past. This is not about glorifying the past, but understanding that past with all its richness to see how it can be leveraged for future development. Development, again, quote unquote, defined very differently by different communities. So one example, for example, this was an opportunity where one had to define a series of development guidelines for open spaces, quote unquote, for the city of Puri. And there are many different lenses that one can approach this from. There is the purely ecological and the deeply geological one that can help define and understand what the present land and its morphology is. And equally important is the sacred landscape, the Shankha Kshetra as it is called, and how that has been interpreted and defined across millennia. We have records, written temple records dating back to the 5th century AD. So it gives us great insights into what was the imagination of the larger city region and how in turn that speaks to the ecological history. So there is the ecological, there is the spiritual and mythological, and the current day social challenges. All of these to be put and read together in a way that can actually start making this. This is one of the oldest maps of Puri. This is actually why it's called Shankha Kshetra. There is no map as we would draw of the coastline or the road or the temple, but how each of that is an abstraction of the Shankha, of Jagannatha. And this also helps you interpret. These are series of interpretations. They may be subject to a lot of very critical analysis by different perspectives, from the archaeological to the geological, but it helps us understand the changing geomorphology of the place. Also, given the fact that this is a very dynamic landscape, it is subject to cyclones every second year. There is varying qualities of the salinity of the groundwater. When you actually start reading them together, the reading of the open spaces start changing dramatically. It is not just the designated ones, it could be the very informal or the very accidental open spaces, each of which has ecological and spiritual histories. So interpretations of these also goes beyond the mere spatial. It's also the experiential. It's about how, for example, at different seasons of the year, during the different ritus, there are different pilgrim routes that happen. It's not just the Maharath Yatra that happens once a year. There are 15 other yatras that happen, which actually connects these crucial dots in the city. Those dots could be celebrated as built spaces, they could also be open or unbuilt spaces. So reading them together actually helps derive a certain understanding, a certain unpacking of the urban systems that we're looking at. And very broadly speaking, the kind of development framework that we came up with was not so much in terms of detailed design, but in terms of approaches to say, is there a sacred and a profane edge to every single aspect? It could be a street, it could be a water body, it could be the seashore itself. And how does one start interpreting those sacred and profane edges from the kind of occupation of that land that has happened in the past, and what kind of activities need to come in there in the present day. So these frameworks actually help develop micro precincts through the city. The idea here was not to create one grand landscape plan, but create a guidance document for any kind of intervention, whether it was building a parking lot for pilgrims, to a recreation space, to a large camp for the Rath Yatra. It could be any and all of these activities, some of them permanent, some of them very, very temporal, depending on the season of the year. Another example, again, a very deeply spiritual yet with a long ecological and cultural history, is this very little known, non-mainstream landscape, which is essentially tantric in nature. Chinnamastika is a very powerful and a very sacred deity in the tantric pantheon, which essentially means that one cannot start interpreting every sacred space as under a broad head of this being Hindu or Buddhist or Muslim, because they are all rooted in very specific practices, and those practices are in direct response to the landscape they occupy. They are not agamic. When I say use the term agamic, it means that it is not simply a set of written rules that they follow, but things that are responding to the landscape as well as dynamic in nature. So how does one start understanding very dynamic cultural, spiritual spaces in a way that when you actually start crafting it, the crafting is not only in terms of what gets built, but what are the abstractions that is behind each of these things. The riverbank, as you can see, for example, is crafted as an articulated and an unarticulated edge, which is both ecological and spiritual. The right bank, as the river flows towards the Sangama, is the one that is most amenable for meandering, given the nature of the river. It is the one that has the most incidence of oxbow lakes or other dynamic landscape features. Whereas the one on the left, which is actually defined by a rocky strata, which is where the temple sits, is much more defined. I will not say static, which means that even the kinds of ghats that one imagines here, because ghats again is not a pan-Indian phenomena, it is very specific to each river system and how they happen. Nitya, Naimittika and Kamya are the different meanings that are given to different ritual systems under the tantric way of thinking, and how those get expressed and what are the kind of both very physical and tangible as well as temporal spaces that it tends to get created. Imaginations are not just driven by a larger vision of urban design or aesthetic, but are defined by the very small nuances of the place. For example, animal sacrifice is very much active. This is not the time and place for us to take a stand to say, oh, I'm an activist, I do not support this. Not my problem at all. We are only responding to the demands of the situation. One of the biggest challenges here was to see not only how the sacrificial altars are organized, what happens to the sacrificial remains, the cooking that happens, because that's part of the ritual, what happens to the blood. So unless you're able to understand that level of the working of the place, this is not about problem solving, but it is about responding to very particular contexts. Every aspect of the ritual, for it to be translated into a defined space, sometimes built, sometimes open, sometimes informally available, but all of that emanating from the rootedness of the place itself. While that example had a lot of givens, or in our modern language, problems to solve, quote unquote, there are also opportunities that you come across where vast greenfield sites are made available for design. As architects or designers, there's nothing more exciting in our minds to say, here is this large piece of land to deal with. But only after many years that each of you will spend in the profession, you will know that is the worst thing that can be handed to you, which has no clues on the ground, no design generators, no given definitions. So you actually have to develop a Sthala Purana literally to say what this land would have been if it had been developed sensibly over the hundreds of years that the larger landscape has developed. This particular landscape has a continuous history. This is close to Hampi. So Hampi is of course the star of the region, but otherwise there is continuous occupation of this land spanning the Paleolithic and the Neolithic eras. So about 3000 years of continuous occupation gives us very definite clues as to how this land would have transformed. Right now, of course, it is in the control of a single entity, but that doesn't mean that we cannot discount the presence of a dolmen or an Inselberg and how early humans would have occupied this territory. The idea was not about creating a theme park. This is not to say here is the Paleolithic era, this is the Vijayanagara era and everybody goes through it. The idea is that even if it is an ecological intervention, what are the various ways in which generations of humans across millennia would have done on this piece of land, right? And not all of it is necessarily physical or tangible. Sometimes, many of them are temporal, some of them span a single year season, some of them span many samvatsaras. So the idea is, how do you look at the cultural and ecological to bring together the idea of a Sthala Purana that is rooted in both the agamic and the folk texts. This is not necessarily reliant only on the written document, but also the lived experiences, the practices that you see. The Mahakavya of the Kuruba community that I read here tells us the 500 years of recorded history of the pastoral community, of how they dealt with the land or how they see the different aspects of land. And that kind of starts giving you clues as to how do you look at occupation of land as would have happened, and what is your responsibility in beginning this new occupation of land. Will it all be done in 1 year? Will it be these grand design lines that I will draw? Or will I allow certain evolutions to happen naturally on the ground? So, what I'm sharing are not necessarily outcomes, but they're just about loud thinking. What are the different clues one can draw from? Could be the classical texts of Varahamihira to the geological history of a place. And together, how do they start helping you interpret that piece of open space? While all this can be very exciting on its own, it still needs to translate into a program that is tangible and workable for the client and the community. And that is where the danger of slipping into a theme park mode always exists, because one is always wanting to show that in the next 6 months and 1 year, but what we were discussing earlier about seeing immediate impact. That's a temptation that has to be fought. How toxic can that fight be or should be is a matter of, all the stakeholders involved in that. And while we are looking at the deep ecological and mythological history, what remains very crucial is the socio-cultural. Socio-cultural not just from a romantic perspective of culture, but the everyday lived experiences. What is the smallest land holding of the farmer in this place? How can this actually become a process of demonstration to say what would be the model one will follow for sustenance of a family? Is it merely agriculture? Is it a pastoral way of living? This is not to choose paths, but to simply allow a canvas for demonstration and experimentation, what I in my work call a living lab. Each of these actually becomes a living lab that is continuously morphing and teaching the ones who are involved. An extreme example from those is what we deal with on the everyday. The extreme urban challenges, both the designated and the leftover open spaces in our own cities. I mean, we had this long conversation on the stormwater drains, which Rajesh worked on for the Rajakaluways. Can we just, jump at them as simply an opportunity for grand design, or will it actually be rooted in the many modalities that defines these systems: social, ecological, cultural, and the political? So understanding and unpacking our own urban spaces, the spaces that we pass by every single day, the badly maintained garbage dump that we see on the side of a road next to a bus stop, which is the only remnant of a Gundutopu or a sacred garden, which has completely vanished from living memory. But to be able to unpack that to see what is its real value in the larger urban system. So these are a collection of studios and urban labs that were done across many cities. We've done this in Goa, Bangalore, Ranchi, Bhopal. So the idea is to be able to lay out a framework, lay out a lot of provocative questions, which allows for different kind of mapping. This would be the traditional way one would map. If you're looking at the stretch between Mavalli and Kempagudikere, this would be how we would actually list down spaces, institutional, public, but also the informal and the underutilized. But what's interesting is when people walk, these are not just architectural design students. These are all the stakeholders who bring in their own thoughts and lived experiences on these spaces to say what are the various ways in which these unbuilt spaces get used. How do we read them together? Is there a narrative that connects them in some way? What are the networks, the social, cultural, livelihood, and ecological, not to mention the spiritual and the mythological, deeply embedded in every single Indian city. Even with a newly laid out city such as Chandigarh is still replete with many of these layers. And once you start looking at the larger picture of how these things tie up, there is of course the purely scientific understanding of the hydrogeology, flooding patterns, and the climate change, but overlaid with the understanding of the cultural and ecological that had happened here. And that will then become the basis for developing the design strategies that are rooted in a place and most importantly dynamic in their response to the community and the natural forces. In our case, of course, the biggest response one wants to see is towards the challenges of climate change. It's not enough to say I have 100-year data of rainfall which tells me the maximum rainfall is 72 mm as design value for cities, whereas every single monsoon, every Indian city has rainfalls ranging anywhere from 150 to 250 mm per day, sometimes in an hour, which is 3, 4, 5 times the design value that we are all dealing with as engineers. So this actually completely changes the way in which you will actually look at the whole idea of resilience and vulnerability. Do I have time for one more? Yeah. So the idea is also not to simply look at very large landscapes or very formal ones or urban ones. What happens when you are confronted with the everyday problem? How do you look at water security in the informal settlements in cities? Is it simply about providing pipe water? Is it about promoting rooftop harvesting or whatever other tropes? I only call them tropes because they're actually quite meaningless in the larger scheme of things. So this is a 5-year work spread across about 70 tribal settlements in and around Ranchi, which had a history of settlement. the Munda and Oron tribes who settled there, around whom the city grew. Of course, like in all Indian cities, now they are the intruders. They are the ones who are occupying land, whereas the city is the formal one, which means they have no access to any kind of services, whether it's roads, sanitation, water supply. So there could have been two approaches here. One was to look at the problem solving. How do we bring water and sanitation to these people? The other was to completely reverse the lens, to kind of move to the other side of the mirror, to see what would have happened to this landscape if the formal city of Ranchi never happened here. What if the high-tech mineral companies and the machinery companies never moved here? There would have been a sustained way of continued living. This is not to romanticize the past, but merely to understand the linkages between ecology and livelihood. And it was very, very surprising, very happily surprised to see that many of those linkages still existed and were still valued by the communities. So mapping the micro elements of the ecology. It could be a Dond, which is a low-lying area that gets flooded in the monsoon. There could be the Tanar, where you have the sacred Sarnasthal, which is the most sacred for the Munda tribe, which actually has no built structure, but is very akin to the Devarkadu we have in the Western Ghats. Each of this is a marker of the ecology and the landscape. And the idea was that how do you then leverage those in a way that you can actually reinforce the social and the infrastructural needs of the people. So this spanned many, many different specializations, if I can use the word, from settlement planning to formal policy framework, land rights, land records, to the deeper geological and hydrological histories of the place. All the work here is not a top-down. This is not, we went one there and got this amazing insight and made this plan. This is working and learning and creating with the community. This is not a parochial relationship where we go and see what needs to be done, but this is to co-create both the definition of the problem and the solution. It's not enough that you have a fixed problem with very creative solutions, because often enough we are actually wrongly defining the problem. So understanding the relationship with the Dond and the Tanar, the Sarnasthal also helps us understand the different relationships from the livelihood to the ecological to the cultural. And the idea was to create demonstration projects to say, okay, these are the resources that we have. How did they function in the past? How can we revive some of them? And who would do it? Who will take ownership? This is not some funded project where somebody goes and does all this. 100% of what we see, the information as well as the process and the ownership of the work that is being done, is completely community driven. It helps that it is a tribal community with a very, very nice social structure, so it's easier. I probably would not be able to do this in an informal settlement in Bangalore, which is a lot more heterogeneous. But the idea was to look at incremental development of these to the extent, this is actually a bad picture sent by one of the residents there, but what you will see is from a very infrastructural approach to looking at water, these open wells have become really spaces of celebration. They are extremely proud of the creation, not just to say I'm going to paint this and put a signage and say here is a well, but it's an everyday community space. And this has happened across a little over 70 settlements, which essentially means that in a matter of about 2 years that the actual physical process took, all these settlements are now completely independent of the city's network of water. They no longer have to beg with the municipal corporation to please give us 2 tankers. They have good quality and year-long supply of water. Yeah, so different geographies come up with different challenges. Very urban, informal settlements, seen from the lenses are very different. In one, it was about water security. In another, it is about livelihood and the challenges of urban heat island. As how does that affect the working of the people? If it is going to be 40 degrees under the shade, their livelihoods are going to be severely impacted. What are those changes that need to be brought in as incremental changes, community-driven processes, which can help transform the communities and make them resilient to a certain extent for future climate challenges. I will stop here. Thank you.
With this, I would request our second speaker to come on stage, architect Rajesh Renganathan. Architect Rajesh is a practicing architect and principal at Flying Elephant Studio, based in Bangalore since 1994. His work covers a wide range of typologies and scales and is spread across diverse geographic settings in India. I would welcome you on stage, sir.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's always nice to come back to RV College. I have a very long association, and so a lot of familiar faces, people, colleagues, and even some people I've taught who are now far more qualified than I am. And so it's nice to see that whole progression, and it's lovely to be back. So that was really, I mean, quite intimidated by the talk given by Mohan, and just it's so educative, and I've always felt that this has come through practice, that we architects are really uneducated about the earth and the planet and landscape in general, and so some of us who just sort of went blindly into the profession had to sort of discover these things, or through actually engaging with projects and slowly sort of navigate this kind of space. So talking about open spaces, so we as architects sort of invariably mediate between interior and outdoor environments. So in order to sort of navigate this territory, we personally felt that there was a need to sort of imagine some sort of a conceptual framework for design, within which architecture and landscape can coexist and converse in meaningful ways. So this is a challenge. So when Salila sent me this program and I found myself sandwiched between two landscape architects, I had to be very careful, about what I said, and and I thought it was actually an opportunity to actually look at landscape from the perspective of a practitioner who is primarily working in the realm of architecture. So I'll just give a few snippets of my own kind of, sort of personal journey here. And in this sort of little vignette of a presentation, I'll just see how we've sort of navigated this space over a few decades of practice. So I called it nested landscapes. It could be nested spaces, but there is something quite familiar and even, I would say, primordial about nested spaces. A sort of a simultaneous sense of being contained and in turn containing something. A few examples that come to mind, these matryoshka dolls and the layers of an onion. And of course, Platonic geometries where you have these sort of, pure geometries which are nested one within the other. But of course, on the other hand, there are also Indian conceptions which often tend to be sort of concentric nests, or what is also been called hierarchic encompassments, like notions of the body, as multiple sheets or koshas. also, I mean, when it's not really uncommon to observe, especially in our traditional architecture, these sort of inside-outside conversations that extend and multiply, as serially sort of nested precincts. And I found this thing quite interesting. So these precincts sort of modulate transitions between different realms, if you like, of public and private, of light and darkness, and the sacred and profane. And some of what I think little extracts from what Mohan was talking about in terms of sacred groves was something which was interested me too, and I'll sort of talk about it. So the example of a nested landscape that has particularly fascinated me, and which was interesting that Mohan also was talking about it, is of course the Devrakadu or the sacred grove. I mean, this is an image, not specifically of the one that I visited, but this was the best image I could find. But it actually began, this sort of interest, it's something which has fascinated me for a long time. And it began with a trip that we made about 20 years back. And in fact, I was teaching at RV College that time, and I do remember actually structuring a studio exercise around it, because it was something I had seen, and then immediately it was sort of in my mind. I don't know if any of you all were part of that studio, but I can't remember. But my wife Sunanda was doing some research on medicinal plants for a film, and she was interested in visiting these sacred groves, and so we were traveling, and I sort of tagged along as her driver. So it was while traveling in Coorg actually that we found this little forest, which was abutting the highway. So this was set in a sort of expanse of cultivated fields, and so we stopped there and we sort of entered this mysterious sort of wooded, very liminal kind of space, and were sort of drawn into the interior. There was a sort of a trail that led us in, and following this sort of winding trail, it finally came to a sort of a clearing, in the middle. And deep within the grove itself. So here we were kind of surprised to see, set in a sort of a sunken rectangular pit, which was, oriented very precisely to the cardinal directions. A little shrine, with a modest shrine, which was, but very precisely articulated. So, and so if you look at it, so you have this, so you have the fields around, and a forest, and then a clearing within the forest, and then a pit within the clearing, a shrine, and there was also these kind of two raised planters in front of the entrance of the temple. One of them had a few thistles, tridents with the pierced lemons. And the other one was a sort of a luxuriant kind of a crop-like plant. So I was talking to another friend with us, and he mentioned that he had seen this plant outside all the barber shops in Bangalore, So which is a kind of a strange thing, And I began to think, if you sort of consider the notion that plants are the hair of the earth, that maybe a barber's vocation is akin to some kind of farming, agriculture of the hair. So one interpretation of this, one began to think about this. I didn't have any knowledge about sacred groves, but one was just, you had a certain impression when you went there, and a certain sort of experience, and you saw these things, and then you're trying to make some sense of it. So one interpretation was really that all this land was originally forest, which was then sort of cleared extensively for agriculture, so what we sort of see is a sort of a so but part of the forest was actually left untouched. So when the entire thing was cleared, part of it was untouched and preserved as a sacred grove. Now within this culture, in some sense, is inserted in the form of a temple, and then these symbols, which my own interpretation, but they sort of relate in some ways, in a very visceral way, to fertility of the earth and sort of agriculture in some senses. So then again, this agriculture is inset into this kind of layered kind of nesting of different kind of images. And I found this actually quite thought-provoking, and it really stayed with me. So that's why I did carry it through to a studio in RV, and later it's always been at the sort of back of my mind during a lot of projects, and we've tried various kind of sort of interpretations of it as we moved along. So in this case, I think it also seemed to me that there was, in the case of these sacred groves, there seemed to be a sort of a conscious intent towards actually, which points towards a sort of a coexistence of different landscapes. So you remove one, but you still retain part of the original one, then you put the other one back, and so you keep. Whenever you remove one type, you still reintroduce at a smaller scale something else which was taken out. So this itself, the sort of nesting, was something which was quite interesting. So and in this case, sort of conserving these pockets of biodiversity in the face of this aggressively expanding human interventions. So we begin then to see the ground as a sort of a palimpsest, okay, which is overwritten time and again, and yet always retaining and revealing traces of past actions. In fact, I was actually these are just some images I quickly picked up from the net. I should give credits to them, but I was actually pleasantly surprised. So this is again about the uneducated architect. That this term actually already exists in landscape architecture, the idea of a palimpsest landscape, and it's a common sort of a technical term, denoting overlays of geologic sort of rocky strata. Then geomorphological sort of features like hills, valleys, and rivers, and finally, at the top of it all, you have human interventions, including even cultivation, settlements, roads, and things like that. And then when you look at it, some very interesting images that's from some parts somewhere in Peru near Lake Umayo, and then you see these sort of traces of this. Terraced walls and terracing, and which have, this land has been occupied for inhabited for sort of over 10,000 years. And of course, very sort of technical kind of look at, when you look at any landscape, actually what you see is this kind of these layers which emerge in different ways. Without getting into the detail, but also the time frames are completely different. So then you have some kind of bedrock which emerges, which is like millions or billions of years old, and sort of this whole time scale and this whole overlay of these different sort of elements. So so from this we were trying to distill this sort of experience, and then try to come, what about these things which were all sort of coming together, and it seemed to sort of point to some sort of an idea of landscape archetypes, if you like. I know it's a very simplistic term, but it's just a way for us as laypersons to try and understand the complexity of things that we see. So you sort of define them as maybe forests, mountains, water, deserts, cultivation. There could be settlements, there could be cities. But what it really is that these are all sort of living environments, and all of them are sort of modified and in turn shaped. Modified, they are accommodated one, and they are modified by and in turn shape varying levels of human intervention. So contrary to the notion that lots of parts of the world are that wild or that settled, but actually we occupy the entire planet, and it's a question of the traces that we leave. So a forest, the traces will be minimal, and in a city it's almost the other way around, where the interventions are the foreground and nature is sort of left behind. But there's this range of sort of the amount of processing that happens to so-called sort of natural. So there is no natural landscape in that sense. So I think this kind of this kind of coexistence, what we see, and this coexistence and a sort of a juxtaposition of such diverse working landscapes offers us quite a rich tapestry of references, for design references really, yes. And I think these are particularly useful. So I mean, I thought this would be interesting for students, and these are particularly useful for practices that actually seek, some sort of an empathetic and pragmatic, practical. A lot of it is utilitarian, sort of engagement with the context. So this was quite interesting, and then we also began to look further, so this had the potential. So what if you sort of combine these utilitarian realities, of such, what is called working landscapes, with also symbolic, a lot of the things that, Mohan talked about, the symbolic arrangements like sacred groves. So the utilitarian then combines with the symbolic to produce what can be sort of new aesthetic expressions. And while we were discussing this, somebody talked about the Tamil Sangam literature, and a very interesting example of such an aesthetic expression is really seen in this classical Tamil literature of the early first millennium, the first few 100 years, which I will just very briefly. It's a topic in itself, but it's very interesting, and I'll just sort of touch upon. So from these kind of like what we would say are generic landscape types, what's interesting in this sort of structure of this Sangam poetics is this poetics of the Sangam period actually employs a sort of a taxonomy, sort of a classification of reality as part of its stock and trade or repertoire. So the 5 archetypal landscapes of the Tamil region, which are categorized as hills, forest, seashore, agricultural areas, and wasteland, but each with its specific forms of life, both natural as well as cultural. Okay, so it includes the animals, the trees, and then the social customs, instruments. They all become part of this sort of a symbolic code for poetry. So what is really happening is that you have the 5 actual sort of landscapes of the Tamil region begin to emerge through this structure as the interior landscapes of Tamil poetry, inscapes if you want to call them. So this was a really, something to dwell upon, and which made us think about, the question then came to mind, could there be architectural expressions where notions of nested landscapes constitute a design vocabulary? In fact, the idea of a microcosm, okay, or paintings within paintings, stories within stories. Actually, this sort of notions present us with just such a possibility. So I will try and illustrate this very, very quickly, but I don't want, we've been actually engaging with this sort of idea over a lot of projects and proposals, and mostly unsuccessful competition entries. But I'll try and just show you one example where we did an architectural competition a few years back, and it had that scope. It was a 100-acre site, and there was some sort of I'll just come back to that. Before I get into the project, so this idea of the microcosm as a little place which sort of includes the characteristics or replicates in miniature some larger context. And of course, the image that comes to mind is, of course, you're all familiar with the story of Yashoda looking at Balakrishna's open mouth, looking for the mud he had eaten, and then seeing the entire universe there, and including the entire cosmos, the earth, and then the village and herself. So the sort of a world built into a world. And this idea of the microcosm is something that we've tried to engage with in several works, and I'll just show you one little example of it. So this was some kind of proposal for a 100-acre site near Mahabalipuram, and for some kind of spiritual organization, and they wanted to create a heritage and cultural center which was in some ways representative of India, okay, but kind of ambitious. So actually, we were thinking that can we create a microcosm of India which is based on these archetypes of landscape, and in the classical kind of categorization you have Aranya, Kshetra, Grama, and Nagara, the wild forests, the fields, the villages, and the cities. So this was a 100-acre site, and so the site itself is sort of organized first as an image. We sort of structured it according to this kind of sort of a design vocabulary, and at the center is a sort of a sacred grove. So this is the image coming from what we have actually seen. And then the sort of peripheral area is sort of seen as sort of a more meadow-like field, cultivation, garden, kind of a sort of a landscape. And then within the sort of this seemingly agrarian kind of setting, you have the smaller settlements, which are sort of placed, which again are echoing the sort of village or the rural kind of areas. And then of course, there was a requirement for some sort of a museum, and so the central sort of a monument, which is actually in some ways recalling the idea of a city. And so you look at this, and then basically, I mean, it's constructing a story to build an idea of when you actually design, you need some sort of a narrative which holds everything together. So there could be many ways to do it, but it always helps to have a strong story when you go to a client. And of course, so these different layers. You had the agricultural layer, then there's a sort of a mound in the center which has the forests, and then of course they were actually close to Mahabalipuram, and they were going toward these salt pan kind of areas. So the lower part of the site was just imagined as some sort of wetland kind of, and of course some kind of peripheral dry areas. But so the thing was that in this specific context, we also overlaid this idea of the from the Sangam landscape, so the 5 tenants. And again, so there's a sort of sorry, that's already come there. Yeah, so that is all, we've already covered that. Sorry. So then the interesting thing here is actually that when you come to the central monument, the story repeats. Okay, so the monument itself is composed of these 5 landscapes. So actually it's as though you're zooming into one element, and the whole story sort of repeats itself. And so this is sort of structured around that, and then you have a sort of a park that leads all the sort of elements of the site itself. And so there is this idea like those Matryoshka dolls, where each part again repeats the story of the larger part. So with that, so what we see actually in this example is really features of a larger context that gather and reconstitute within a new design intervention, replicating it in miniature. So this recalls sort of notions of concentrically nested worlds, where, and I'll use the word of one of my favorites, A.K. Ramanujan, who says, what is contained mirrors the container. The microcosm is both within and like the macrocosm, and paradoxically also contains it. So I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the talk, sir. I would now request our third speaker, architect Varna Shashidhar ma'am. She is a landscape architect with a regional landscape practice, VSLA, in Bangalore, that focuses on creation of contextual landscapes. She holds Bachelor's of Architecture degree from RVCE and Master's degree in Landscape Architecture from Graduate School of Design at Harvard. She has taught at GSD's Career Discovery Program and worked with leading landscape practices, MVVA, VRT, before establishing VSLA in 2013. Architect Varna's interest lies in intersection of built and natural world in the ecology and aesthetics of everyday South Asian landscapes. Recent project includes Bangalore International Center, Neve Academy, BYG Brisky, and Namma Park. I welcome you, ma'am.
Good morning. It's such a privilege to be a part of the symposium at our college, RV. I'm extremely grateful to Professor Salila, the principal, Professors Ajinkya, Shalini, and Meera for inviting me here. It's also an honor to be here with my teachers and mentors, Architect Rajesh Renganathan and Mohan Rao sir. They've set up a beautiful premise which has looked at open space from both a larger systemic perspective, a spiritual perspective, a perspective that connects with the cultural history of our country, also from a very temporal, liminal perspective, so beautifully folded together in Rajesh Renganathan sir's presentation. I think my presentation deals at a more pragmatic level. How can young practices aspire to work in the public realm in the South Asian context? And how can we contribute to the collective? I run a small practice, very few people, based in Bangalore, working around the Indian subcontinent. The idea was always to really look at landscape, working in the realm of catering and sort of providing more a social as well as ecological impact. And it's not always very easy for young practices to find work in the public realm. So basically, the idea in this case behind my practice also is to really look at creating opportunities even in the private realm and sort of really look at ways in which small efforts can lead to greater impact and therefore contribute to the collective landscape. The focus of our practice has always been to really look at the Indian context. Really, landscape architecture as it's prevalent in India and the perception of landscape is very different from the way Western landscapes work. It's seldom about panoramas and views and sort of the distance between an observer and the landscape, but in Indian landscapes, it's all about landscapes being embedded in everyday life. I think landscape architect Mohan Rao has sort of really taken us through the breadth of ways in which people are engaged in the landscape. So the focus of my practice also tends to be to really discover and celebrate the extraordinary in the everyday ordinary, whether it's materials, whether it's the plant palette, whether it's how we interact and become and engage in the landscape. So I'm going to take you through three projects, relatively small in scale. The first is actually a recent project. It's literally a pavement which becomes a part of a private residence. And the idea here is to talk about opportunities that you can engage in where you can contribute to the public realm even if the scale is really small. For those from Bangalore, Pandurang Nagar is a typical suburb in Bangalore, South Bangalore. So the project was literally designing the landscape for a house which was 40 by 60 feet. This is the house, and literally, as you can see, there is no open space. There were 2 street trees that was present on the street, and then so really looking at how can this really contribute to the public realm, and how can you really actually approach the project in a way that we've engaged with the pavement, and the whole project became redesigning the pavement, creating a shaded space for pedestrians, which in many ways contribute to the quality of life within the building. This actually became a filigreed filtration system that wraps around this very, very tight residential project. At higher levels, every room and living space sort of opens out into the tree canopies. The private space was limited to 4 feet, which actually totally reduces to almost 6 inches. So the idea was to really create a borrowed landscape, and this borrowed landscape comprised of adding about 7 street trees and sort of reworking the pavement system. So it's a small intervention, but I think it's impacted both the lives of the residents in the house as well as pedestrians on this very, very tight urban project. With that, I'd like to move into another project. Once again, it's not totally a public project, it's a private institution, but it's a democratic institution that is totally open and free for public to actually engage in. This is Bangalore International Center, located in Bangalore. It was a competition project that I worked on with 100 hands, and we were involved in this project from 2017. And what was very challenging is this is the site. It is located adjacent to a nala, and this nala, or the storm sewer, is not always clean. It has effluents. It's actually extremely polluted. During summers, there's a lot of stagnation, flotsam, debris. It's also located next to an derelict park in Bangalore and the army grounds. The site is extremely tight. It's 1 acre, and the project had extremely high programmatic built requirements. It included a 185-seater auditorium, multiple classrooms and lecture spaces, galleries. So also the neighborhood is extremely dense. Noise levels were very high, almost 85 dB. So the challenge was the open space available was very limited, and a part of it is public open space about 20 feet wide adjoining the nala. One of the greatest challenges was totally degraded soils on site. So this is the condition of the site and the soils that was available. And the idea behind the landscape or the design here was to really look beyond the challenges, to really look at how this particular project can become a connector, which went beyond the site constraints, looking at connecting the entire corridor beside the nala, looking at it as a riparian corridor that would actually work towards the potentials. We already observed the corridors by the nala had a lot of bird life, urban mammals. So we really wanted to treat this as a riparian corridor that sort of connects across through the army lands, along the degraded, the derelict park, all the way through to actually become a larger amenity that went beyond the site boundaries of just 1 acre. So this is the plan, and how we sort of treating it is the front has been conceptualized as almost a linear garden. It was a very, very narrow space. We had 1.5 meters here and there as well. Sometimes it actually tapered down. So the idea here was also to really look at landscape not as one zone, creating it as 2 zones. The outer one sort of connecting with the public street and the existing street trees, to create a wider expanse of a garden and allowing people and the neighborhood to feel connected to the building, whereas the inner landscape actually has a more whimsical nature. It's a pollinator garden which attracts series of pollinators, and the building, which is more sedate and solid, sort of wraps it around with a touch of whimsy. The entire front then actually becomes a space where people take breaks between performances, a foreground to the building. It's very active with exhibitions and science exhibits and multiple installations happening in the front. Also, pop-ups regularly happen. And apart from this space, looking at the edges, which was very narrow, and then also a little bit of a step-out region. The idea with this was to really convert this into more a biological pond, although there was very little depth available, simply because to really create more of a borrowed landscape and sort of screen the interior from the ramp, the vehicular ramp that takes you to the parking. Also, this is the southwest to really filter winds that come into the lobby space. The third zone within this design was actually the linear corridor towards the rear, which is actually a meander space. It's a rain garden. It's a space that filters water, sort of cleanses the soil before it reaches the storm water. So essentially these were the regions available. The zones that were available for planting. And then really looking at what paving can do. Even the paving had to be positioned in the way that this public institution that's open for large numbers of people. We would like for this to be extremely friendly to differentially abled people accessing this public institution, whereas the entire Nala corridor becomes a space that has been dry laid with local stone, chapali stone, and gravel, which also allows percolation. As you can see, given a very tight space, there was a series of services that had to be accommodated, so the landscape had to work within this condition. So unlike a large amount of open space, a lot of small spaces have a lot of challenges that you encounter, and the sites are very gritty. And these were all the layers that went into making of the landscape. So it was subtle, it was layered and very textural. And sort of really the ideas between the two spaces, one very organic, the other one more formal and sedate. Using material, a lot of material from waste chips of the interior paving was used, within the external garden. These are kota stones that sort of create a more organic feeling within a more formal garden. And then the entire driveway pattern, which had to accommodate movement of people with walking sticks, and we tried and tested all of this. So essentially the entire front, which actually becomes the green way, is the condition of this was like this. Sort of the two bands of planting that were available. And sort of really looking at it as a space that can be used and accessed by all residents and visitors. You can see the amount of available space. Sort of the building, the space that was available, and the driveway in the center. And really now it's actually a zone that is actively used. And the whimsical garden space actually provides more screening and sort of creates a third zone or a threshold between the building and the outside, between the driveway even, where a lot of activities are housed. Yeah, this was a threshold or the in-between zone which faces the pollinator garden. So there is a lot of screening that happens and sort of a very filigree connection between the inside and the outside space. It's almost the idea of creating various zones within a singular landscape. This was the space which opens out into, which was once a space like this, very, very narrow setback, and faced the derelict park space. So the idea was to really convert this into a biological pond and sort of really plant it so that this forms a backdrop. And also there is a small micro ecosystem that's set up here, which is a huge feature for people who visit this space. A lot of kids are drawn to this environment especially. This is how the space was. As you can see, hardly any space between the neighboring park as well as the lobby. Now it's a foreground for most of the exhibitions and activities that happen. This was the Nala corridor, and the condition we found the Nala corridor with a lot of water seepage. This was the site and the conditions of the Nala corridor. And as you can see, this is what inspired the whole ideation of this space, literally as a riparian corridor in a space for urban mammals and birds. So, dry chappi stones which are normally used in fencing posts has been dry laid. And we've created a rich network, mostly with local and adapted species of planting. A lot of these plantings encourage filtration of water. As you can see, this is the condition that's been created. And a very, very rich mixed species of planting. Several of the species enable cleansing of water, cleansing of soils, and phytoremediate. And this was the vision we had for the linear meandering driveway. And so the high density of planting, gravel, soils lead to filtration before the water enters a perforated subdrain. So reducing the capacity on the Nala. It's also very fragrant, textural, colorful, creating a sensorial experience for people who walk in this corridor. As you can see, we would have loved to, sort of have the ability to sort of intervene within the larger realm. But as it comes to spaces, you'll understand there are lots of stakeholders and our capacity remains limited sometimes and we cannot intervene in the Nala space. But possibility with the riparian buffer to reach out and therefore impact. So we've also installed several found objects within this corridor. The workers' grinding stone has actually become a spot where birds drink from and butterflies drink from. They also convey the history of workers working on the site over this extended period of time. So small moments within this biodiverse corridor. We've used a lot of local planting, brahmi and salvias, tulsi. Very rich and textural. despite being in the city, it provides a moment of refuge that sort of transports you away within this landscape. Yeah, from a private sort of initiative, the idea was to really look at how people can collectively come together to impact open spaces. And a project that we looked at, and through this initiative called Open Space Collective, we hope to bring together residents, not necessarily designers, people of various professional groups, people who really care for open spaces within their own environment. This started off as a small competition in 2014 where we adopted an open space right in front of our own office, and neighborhood kids came together, people from the community came together. We got the corporator of the community to also be a part of this. So, and a neighbor who was also an architect. So, this is the open space. It's a 100 by 120 feet small park, which was once very derelict. You will notice it had become a dumping ground. A lot of trash was dumped there. Burning would happen. People would burn things, and a lot of broken equipment, very, very dangerous. But what we observed was that people continue to use this space because it's a lot of the homes there were very small, 15 by 20 feet in dimension, with about 8 to 10 people living there, and this was naturally functioning as their urban living room. So these were the kids from the neighborhood who were involved and had no place to be in. And this is a small group called Eco Warriors from Jayanagar 5th block, and this was a condition of the park. And then we worked with them to really begin to look at what did the neighborhood really need and what could this abandoned open space actually become. So the idea here was the park already had a fence or a bailey, and we were really looking at how, we could, with this existing peepal tree and a ficus tree that existed here, really work with the geometry of what existed, really look at creating a core or a central space that was open to children and an outer peripheral zone that would be open to everybody else from the neighborhood. We were looking at creating almost a trail of edible gardens to the edge and rain gardens along the edge and walking trail around this tight park, whereas the center could be completely given to children and the fence would actually become a play element. So that was the idea that we were looking at, and these were some images of what we wanted to do, but the local BBMP had very different plans for this. They came and they plonked their regular fence, the heavy fencing, the BBMP fencing all around. So the idea of this particular space had to change. So we worked with what we had, with still retaining the peepal tree, retaining the existing trees, creating a pathway that would still function as a pathway and a walking trail, and really looking at dedicating the core towards 2 children. We were looking at working with the ubiquitous BBMP fencing, really look at how this becomes something which would actually work with movement, and then signage, and really looking at retaining a lot of existing trees and plants and really adding a more sensorial component using fragrant planting, a lot of plants that attracts butterflies and pollinators. So this is the condition of the small park now. I'm really quickly going to take you through 2 other smaller efforts. One is a village pond that we worked with 100 hands. This is in Chittoor, and what is fascinating about this project is it's a self-built project by the villagers of Chittoor. They contacted us. They had identified a space which they wanted to convert into an open space, and basically this is the site, and they completely self-funded it and self-built this. So basically the site is opposite a government high school, a Zilla Parishad school, this was the site next to Gram Panchayat office, and this is the local community. The site had a small Ganesha temple, and it was a catchment, a very dry lowland area, this is the way the site actually was. And what we have really done is converted this into a village pond using local stone, pitched this, and a walking trail, and a space for the community to exist, school children to come here and occupy the space, villagers to actually take their daily walks and come to the temple, a Varna or a temple garden where they could get their temple flowers, and seasonally, especially during the festivals which brings in people from outside, a lot of villagers coming from outside created a platform for their annual Harikatha. So a space for their annual events as well. So this is the overall master plan, basically a loop that runs across, containing a space to actually collect water, and then a small garden that acts as a threshold to bring people in. A few public amenities was added by 100 hands, ATMs and resting spaces, and a podium which functions for Harikatha, which can flood whenever during the monsoons. So these are some images from when they built the pond. So the local pitching technique has been used. It was all completely built by the villagers in 6 months. And this is a picture after they built the pond, immediately after. I really don't have recent pictures. But the first Harikatha and gathering that happened at the pond. And so these are recent Google Earth images, and this is what the park and pond looks like. I'm going to end with this last project. Essentially, I think it talks about what landscapes can do, especially when it comes to large-scale infrastructural projects. This was a competition project that we took part in 2014, which we didn't win. It was actually a metro rail median design competition, and the stretch was a very small stretch. It was a 1.5 kilometer stretch in Metugoda and Karnataka. But we really looked at this entire median stretch, almost this 72 kilometer median stretch, as an extraordinary opportunity. We looked at the stretch literally as, I'll just show you the stretch. We were looking at the entire stretch we wanted to create a signature corridor, green corridor for Hyderabad that is reminiscent of Hyderabad's rich geomorphological history. So, we thought that this would be a great opportunity. So we did studies. We studied the history of this of the city. We studied. We did a detailed study of the history. We were looking at this entire metro rail corridor and what this 72-kilometer metro rail corridor actually meant, and looking at the studying the geomorphology of Hyderabad, and also the biodiversity that exists, and then really thought of how we could conceptualize this entire space as an ecological strand with a series of gardens that work with movement of vehicles, almost as glimpse gardens, and gardens where people would pause, where there could be installations, time that would, where people would spend a little more time. So working with movement and heavy traffic, noise traffic, really creating a series of spaces that works with the underlying ecology of the space. We had temporal, seasonal gardens, like flowering gardens. We were looking at the way in which we could harvest water from the entire metro network, and that in many ways could actually work with the geological language of Hyderabad, whether it's recycled and reclaimed stones, and really looking at the ideas of treating water within this narrow stretch. looking at areas which would talk about the geology of the site, the ideas of boulders and recycled slabs, ledges, rock beds, which would actually be glimpsed by the motorists. Also, the idea of inserting urban scrub jungles within this space that would attract biodiversity. And then how this space would then transform from day and night, the idea of actually installing optic screens that would work with movement, and then during the day, the character of the space. So I feel open spaces can actually really highlight, hidden ecologies, whether it's in urban environments or it's more in rural environments. And we're very lucky to be in a city like Bangalore that offers us with so many opportunities. And I think the way we can approach it, even with small practices and younger practices, to really look at coming together as collectives and working towards impacting in as many ways as we can, even with small projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Architect Varna. Thank you so much for the talk. Now I would request our moderator, Architect Meera Vasudeva, to come on the stage. I would now introduce her. Architect Meera Vasudeva runs studio called Myriad, a multidisciplinary, idea-driven space in Bangalore. An alumnus of RVCA 2022, she had a master degree in architecture from University of Delft, Netherlands in 2006, where she has worked at understanding city, architecture and placemaking through her academic research. Architect Meera's interest lies in interface between architecture and allied disciplines. Her work attempts to critically explore the grey of space, the threshold at which the ideas influence each other to give rise to multidisciplinary multiplicity of perspective and uses. I would request ma'am to please join us on the stage.
Signifiers, and then it becomes this act of placemaking. So, that was, so for example, what is the ideal versus the real? And at points when you start thinking of like abandoned quarry landscapes, where nature takes over, or for example, of course, famously we have, that iconic image of the Angkor Wat temple, or you have Chernobyl, where at every point, nature obviously has had the urge to take over. So at what point is, natural versus designed, and when do we decide to stop, to intervene?
This is like sitting in the last minute. Yeah, I mean, this is one of a very pertinent and also a long-standing question, because, for example, when I was a student, one of the statements we started with when I began landscape architecture was the definition of design was, quote unquote, to impart order to nature. This comes, of course, from a long Eurocentric, anthropocentric worldview of what design is all about, but also very deeply rooted in it are the binaries of the ideal or the real. I mean, these are binaries that actually force a framework, a non-existent framework for us to deal with, which really is not productive in the end. I mean, it's great as intellectual mastication of a certain term, but really in the whole time scale, whether it's human history or geological history, are we so arrogant as to say I will shape nature, whether I'm doing it in a 500 square feet or 5,000 square kilometer one? So yeah, you use the word intervention, and I think that's a much more sensitive and more pragmatic way to look at things. Intervention with a certain purpose. A purpose could be betterment of human society, betterment of the microsystem, microclimate, or any such purpose, but not driven by a ideology of design that is imposed from any context. I'm not even saying using the binary of the European versus Indian, which itself is a binary. But within that, there are many other ways to think about it. And just to extend what Rajesh said about there is no such thing as natural landscape is very valid, because every organism on the planet morphs and changes and influences its environment. Could be a termite, could be an elephant, could be humans. It's only a question of how permanent is that change and how destructive is it to other creatures. That's the differentiator. Otherwise, all landscapes across the globe has been occupied and transformed by other creatures, of course by humans in a very visible manner, but so also from the others.
Yeah, I think I would sort of I think Mohan has sort of covered it, but particularly, I would say that typically, what we sort of grew up with was, we tended towards a sort of a design overkill, in terms of trying to, like you were given like an architect is given a piece of, a stage, a property, a site, and you want to sort of control the entire thing. So we're sort of control freaks of some kind, and we believe that we have to sort of occupy, in a sense, that the entire plot that we have given. But I think that over the last few decades, and I think that people are obviously aware that there's so that then what you see is this, you pave everything, you make everything sort of sterile, in the name of sort of usability, so that means, okay, we like to walk on flat surfaces, so flatten the whole site, or water can attract mosquitoes, so a lowland is filled up, so first step when you come to a site and you see that it's low, the engineers will tell you that first thing is you fill it up, you raise yourself 1 meter above all your neighboring sites and discharge everything around you. So that's obviously there's been a long history of complete overkill, which is just about insensitivity to anything other than your own convenience. And I think that's changing a lot, and you can see it also in the larger even landscape. I think these kind of boardwalk raised interventions which go into wetlands, and where there's a conscious thing of actually allowing, and so it's both best of both worlds. So you're actually creating, like even what's the Chinese landscape, some of their interventions, and where you actually able to do both. So you create actually these concrete or sort of walkways, but they are sort of lifted over the ground, and then the rest of it is sort of flowing. So there are ways in which you can sort of balance convenience with the least amount of disruption to sort of other systems. And I think that more and more we are becoming aware of the importance of this just being over other species, non-human agencies in where we live, and the whole idea is not to sanitize whichever space that you go to. So again, you have to strike that kind of, how do you sort of minimize that or minimize the sort of footprint which you sanitize, and create for a very sort of human-centric kind of occupation. But I think at a broader level, I would say, I think the notion of this nature, this the Levi-Straussian category of nature versus culture is obviously being questioned, and I think, and that lies at the root of the problem. As we see ourselves as separate, culture as separate from nature, and that is all, again, being questioned a lot in various kind of discourses over the last few decades, and I think that's what I find interesting also in the
in the Tamil Sangam poetry, actually it's not about a city in opposition to nature. Actually, human settlements are in each of these landscapes. So there is a human activity within the hills, there is within the agricultural tract, within the forest, and there are different degrees and there are different ways in which you occupy. So it's not about human versus nature, and the human existence is sort of not set in opposition, but is a part of and then the landscape. You are the landscape that you are set in. So that is, I think, an interesting way where this whole nature versus culture idea is completely dissolved, and I think it's happening at multiple levels. But what we're trying to do, I think, now is to see how much we need to do, and what is really required, and to sort of occupy the land, and nothing more than that.
I actually didn't ask if you all had questions to ask of each other.
We're going to have a massive fight.
Please, can you do it right now?
I think we would love to hear your thoughts on each other's works as well.
What I would like to say is I was just fascinated by Moses' diversity of projects, sort of the entire repertoire, and sort of really looking at it from a larger systemic level to a level where you've gone into policy, planning, then implementation. I think it's fantastic, and the body of projects and work that you've created through your practice. So my question would be, how did you start working in these spheres, and how do you really work in such a fluid system where you're dealing with the public realm in a great way, but you're also looking at policy making as well as design? How does this whole process really work, and do you feel you've been very successful in this thing? And what advice would you give other practitioners?
The best advice I can think of is don't do what I'm doing. It's terrible. It's not easy. But in all seriousness, it's not like you have a strategy that you read about in the Harvard Business Review to say, I'm going to do this and take here. We were talking about the idea of karma and how you approach it and what it means, and you just do what comes to you and what you're supposed to do. The idea of binaries has always been important. Commercial versus non-commercial, but it's not like Bollywood versus Sham Bengal, which is again another construct we have in our minds, or to say something is public or something is private, or any of these constructs. It's work that is valuable, that you think you can contribute to in some way. Of course, over the years, your role changes in many ways, from an absolute novice to an equal contributor. That's also a journey, but I don't think I ever had milestones. Even now, the milestones are not about the scale of project or any such thing. And other than to say, having extremely fortunate with the kind of opportunities to engage with people, culture, geographies, but equally so, if I can use the term, to be humble about the learning that happens, which unfortunately a lot of us stop at a very early age. I think that should be the differentiator, and not to have milestones. The gestation period of these projects are incredibly heartbreakingly slow. It's not, many of them I will never even see them complete in my lifetime. But if that becomes a benchmark, and it is a very natural one to have as a human, let alone as a practitioner, to say I need to see this complete. itself becomes a barrier to begin with. There are things that you've started, hopefully in 2 generations it will be complete, but that's all you can hope for. You can't fast track nature as much as you can fast track culture. So I think in a conventional sense, those are failings of a practice, that you cannot see something complete, you cannot steer something all the way, you cannot be in control. The idea of control that Rajesh mentioned is very crucial. You can at best be a contributor, sometimes more or less important than the others, but to wield absolute control, to see it complete, to be driven by the vision is wishful thinking, which really doesn't allow you the same opportunities.
Well, I also have, I recognize what you're talking about and this whole time scale, and I think that we need an incredible amount of patience in the profession. And I think the whole time scale of projects is very, like right from interiors, which happens very fast, and then architecture, which typically, so after a certain point you reach a stage where you really don't care when a project, someday somebody tells you that people are occupied, and so you can't be waiting, for that. But the question I have for you, Mohan, is, also when you're dealing with so many different contexts and, and scales and all that, I think you probably, I don't know how, to get into a place, right, you need a lot of information on the ground, and and that can never happen from from somebody who's coming in for a project. So I guess you must have developed a way of sort of interacting with a whole range of kind of domain sort of experts and people on the ground who see things quite differently. So maybe you want to tell us something about that and how that sort of helps you, or how does that work?
Yeah, this is really important. Even if you're not working in a diversity of geographies, even if I were to just work in southern Karnataka, today I could be working with Intruders, tomorrow with Vasudev, it's a very different context. Yeah, early on I used to be the firm believer, the English educated one in background research, secondary research, get all the data together. Yeah, it's fine, but it really doesn't help you connect with the place in any way. You could do a technical solution, of course. The way I don't really know if I have a process, maybe something that I have muddled through is to talk and listen to people, a very, very diverse range of people, without being condescending, without being patronizing. A lot of it cannot be documented or even captured. I mean, the Rajrappa, the Tantric temple, is a classic example. We spent days and days with everyone from the devotees to the priest, not so much as an interview mode to say make notes, but just to kind of help it sink in. And that's also something that adds to the time. There's very rarely an opportunity where you can go in and just parachute into a landscape and have a solution ready. It takes time. Which, if we were again looking at a conventional practice, would make no sense, because you're taking off the time to say, I'm being paid for so much and I need to spend so much. Again, I've been fortunate enough to have at least that luxury of time to engage before you think. I think that's an important differentiator. And that engagement could be folk art to music to the coming Sangam that you mentioned. We've used the same framework across the country. The messenger poetry of Kalidasa to Varahamihira. I mean, these are just sources. I can't think of them as A or B, but they all just kind of come together to contribute. And to keep the process and the learning as open as possible. You never know where the next manna from heaven is going to come into your land. What would that source be? There's no telling. So I really have no answers except to say it's just hard work, but also greatly enjoyable, just to be immersed in a place.
Just to add to that, I mean, considering sort of the kind of people you have had to interact with, how difficult was it to sort of cease to be an outsider and start sort of working both in terms of design and execution, you know, from as an insider? So I'm sure there must have been, say, opposition, questions. I mean, that's a cross for all three of you.
Yeah, I don't think I have ever been an insider anywhere. It's impossible. That's only a way to free ourselves of our guilt, to say I'm this benevolent human who will become one with the tribals. Absolutely no chance. And this is not about faraway cultures. I can never be one with the client in Bangalore. Why will I be one with the client with the Nicobar people? It's impossible. It's just that enough recognition to say you will always be an outsider. It's like a doctor coming and treating you. He or she is not going to become your family member. But that recognition to say I'm an outsider also helps you understand the limitations of your role. You cannot bulldoze over others' opinions. And ultimately, for good or bad, the decision makers are the people who are using it. I may think of it as the worst solution. I can warn them of catastrophic results, but ultimately it is their call. And that is something that is very difficult for us to accept, given our OCD for control. You just have to kind of learn to deal with it.
Varna, it would be nice to hear sort of, you know, you in terms of opposition with, say, you're talking about intimate spaces, an extremely urban context. So what would you sort of want to add to that?
What Mohan Rao says is actually very valid, because you are in the process of discovering till the very end, and maybe your perspective towards the project also changes over time. So it's really hard to stop the process and to stop learning, I feel.
I want to ask the audience if they have any questions.
Good morning. I would like to ask two questions, as in terms of when infrastructure has been planned in any city for that matter, we don't really look at what is left behind after the infrastructure has been created. And we really slowly we understand we have left behind a lot of spaces which ultimately becomes voids in the city. As we nowadays call it voids, they become leftover spaces. Sometimes with over a period of time, they even become negative spaces. It has not yet come to that point in Bangalore, but we do see that in other metropolitan cities. What is your take as a landscape architect? Definitely we need to look at the root cause, but what is your take on that? And secondly, what I would like to know as practicing landscape architects is, do you as landscape architects suggest that these kind of spaces should not be left behind? Because now when we speak to planners, what they say is these spaces are in the pipeline, or rather the design is in the pipeline. It's going to happen right away. It's going to happen, and India is a developing country, so this is happening. So what is your suggestion towards these?
That's actually very important.
I'm not a landscape architect, but I'll still take part of the question. I think one of the things that happens is, and this is a real disease which is spread through our public, projects, is that this is what I've personally experienced, is we just don't give it enough time. And it's always we've been engaged with government projects, various kinds in different parts of the country, and it's always the same story. There's some election, or there's some, so the deadlines for projects are all based on something which has nothing to do with the work that is actually to be put in for that project, and this is really tragic, because there's no
there's no shortage of money actually, so people are willing to put hundreds of crores into these things, thousands of crores, but and this has to really, I think that has to stop, because what you're talking about as the leftover spaces is because the whole project has not been thought through, so that one part of it is done, and then what happens, what are the effects of it left as you said, future projects. So, I'll give you an example of what Mohan was talking about. There was a competition for a 1 kilometer long nala, which is, which is very near my house and office. And we won that competition. And we had taken an approach where we were looking at it not just as a landscape project, but really, also an urban space, but also trying to look at this whole issue of these kind of flash floods which happen for some hours in that neighborhood, because this entire kind of hard the entire drainage system. Several of the tanks around have been sort of become defunct, and so when you look at that kind of project, and what we also proposed was some of the things that need to be done at a neighborhood level, and which would actually culminate in that project. But then, it goes, so then we made a proposal to BBMP and said it will take 6 months to do that. That was after a lot of argument. We felt it needed more time, but then we said, okay, we can manage to do it in 6 months. Then you go for a meeting, and there's some very, active urban agencies and non-government agencies who have been interacting with them, and everybody's trying to do something good, but and then you go there for a meeting, and then they say, no, we want it in 2 months, okay? And then you go back, and then finally when so that's agreed, and then finally they say they want it in 2 weeks because the BBMP election is coming. So this is how projects get done, and then it's just something, then you do some kind of basic drawing, and a DPR gets done, and in that particular case, an estimate of 35-40 crores, and it just goes through. So when there is no time for kind of engagement and actually thinking things through, even in our proposal, there are a lot of things which are not thought through. So we need to actually develop it. So this thing of just jumping from a concept or some rendering and some few drawings to execution and tendering it out is completely it's nonsense. And I'll give you an example. There have been some international competitions that we have taken part in, and you look at the way in Korea, for example, or in Asian countries, where a 1 lakh square foot building, and the tendering of that after you win the competition is 1 year ahead. Okay, so, and these are public projects, and they know that this is if you have to do the project, you have to develop the design, you have to think everything through, what its impacts are, to detail it out, it takes time. And if you just rush through these things, that's what you sort of end up with. But I think Mohan, probably has much more experience in this area.
Yeah, it's a matter of accountability at many levels. The accountability from the public agency is what Rajesh is talking about. What I would like to do is to turn the lens on ourselves to say, what do we do as professionals? Because we are clearly very possessive of our titles. If I'm an urban planner or a landscape architect, and I would like to hold on to that fortress, right? Even from a perspective of collaborative thinking, it is very, very uncommon in the profession to do that, which is why you have linear and fragmented processes. Somebody is a transport engineer, somebody is an urban planner who will do the land use, after which they will call someone else, not call, or maybe I'll force myself to say, hey, let me plant trees here. That's really no way to even conceptualize a project. But more importantly, even if we are allowed to create the best team, our frames of reference are so wrong. The whole pattern of urbanization, the benchmarks that we have, is all driven by not even a European urbanization, but the American school, where they could easily go and occupy an entire continent that didn't belong to them. But here you want to replicate the same pattern of urbanization in a land that's been occupied for 5,000 years. and suddenly you start seeing villages and temples and forests as nuisance that is coming in the way of development. So it actually begs us to question our framework of reference, even in the approach to design and planning.
That past experience speaks.
Is there anyone who would like to ask a question?
Good morning. It was a fantastic presentation. Bhavni sir did say that some percentage has to be allocated as open space, but the quality that the open space should have hasn't been defined anywhere in any DPR. So I think Meera also asked a question like, how would you position yourself? So I think we as landscape architects or architects can give the quality that an open space requires, and it was very interesting to see it in different layers that has been told now. And one thing that struck me was we all are living in adult controlled environments. We cater to adult needs, and it was really interesting to see a project for the children in terms of that small park that was designed. And I only have to say that in my experience, the parks or the public spaces that our city has to offer to the children are often devoid of open free spaces, and that is what the child intrinsically needs to explore, to make up their own world out of whatever affordances they have. And it was very nice to see the project. So, thank you so much.
Anyone with more questions?
Good morning. I just have a small question regarding nested landscape. So I think we have seen Singapore as of such. So we have those gardens which taper over from the bottom to the top. So my question is like, how is nested landscape and parametrical models related, or are they differentiated? Like, I just want to know the differentiation between.
Actually, I don't know what a parametrical model is.
Sir, it's like.
Means exactly that.
It's like what to say. Like, I'm not more into the parametric concept, but I have seen such. But I have heard this word of parametrism, which is like using making up a wireframe structure sort of thing.
So this is the gardens by the bay.
Yeah, rain gardens basically, sort of. Yeah, so I just had this question in my mind. Like, we don't have in India, right, regarding rain gardens as such, so.
Yeah. Because I didn't get the question. I mean, okay. Yeah. So. Yeah. Okay. You're saying something like specific pockets of.
Yeah. Something.
Yeah. So what your question is, why we don't have this in...
No, differentiate. How do you differentiate it, sir? Like the first picture when you showed, it was like a solid within a solid, and that in wireframe structure.
Yeah.
So
okay, I'll try to explain. See, like if you look at the sacred grove. Let's just to explain what nested I meant by nested. Okay, so the first examples was just typical kind of ideas of nesting, like those Russian doors, one sits within the other. So there's sort of a replication of a certain element at different scales, and one is containing the other. Okay, like you also have sometimes stories.
Just a second.
This one, sir. This is road. Yeah. Nuclear.
Yeah. So
So those were just to explain how one thing gets sort of housed in another, okay? And that's also related to what I later talked about, like a microcosm. So within a limited space, you somehow, or a limited project, when we do a project, it's always within a limited framework. But sometimes you sort of recreate an image of the larger context, or something much larger within the limitations and framework of a small project. So in that sense, even what like Varna was talking about, very small scale. So you can see a whole world even within 10 square feet. Yeah, like a fractal. So you can progressively go into smaller parts, but still see the whole, right? But in the context of this landscape and open areas, what we see some sort of types of landscape, which in our image, like for example, there's a difference between a forest and a meadow. Okay, so when you walk in a forest and you walk in a meadow, so meadow I would put in the same category as a field, a garden. Whereas forest could be an orchard. So it's also about the scale, and one you're immersed in, one you're walking on. It's a different kind of a feeling. So similarly, there are, when you're on a flat land or you're on a wet area, or each has a strong character. Okay, and sometimes these come together in interesting ways. Now, when you look at you take Google Earth and you look at some image, typically of some land, you'll see all these sort of basic elements. You see the fields, then some orchards. You see water. You see the tanks. You see small settlements. Okay, so what I was talking about is that and sometimes you see them coming together in very sort of curated and sort of symbolic kind of expressions, like in the sacred grove, where you have like you had a setting which was agricultural, but then there is a remnant of a forest which is left there. Okay, so the forest is nested within an agricultural setting, but within that you make a hole in the forest, which is a clearing. Okay, again you're creating a meadow-like space. Then you're creating, so these are again very nebulous and sort of organic spaces. But then within that you create something very precise, like a rectangular pit and a very precise temple, which is again like a miniature settlement of some a built kind of element. But then again after that you introduce these agricultural kind of symbols, which is again what was on the outside is coming as a small piece inside. So what I was interested in is how these kind of typical landscapes sort of keep reinserting. The last element could be a flower in somebody's hair, or in your coat, which is the forest which has come and placed on you. So to me this is interesting material for a designer. Okay, and all of us, we practice and we put things together. So it gives us a sort of a framework where sometimes we can work with these sort of elements, and this kind of nesting creates interesting relationships. You could have, and architecture could actually mediate. Sometimes architecture could work as a splice. You could be joining two landscapes with a piece of built elements.
It's a continuous loop.
Yeah. So that's what I meant in terms of nested landscapes. And it's just something that we sort of, through that sort of experiences that we have, and we began to think about and felt that this was interesting material to work with.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, anyone else?
It's not a question, it's more of an unformed thought actually. So thanks again, it was amazing, the set of presentations, and as Meera also mentioned, the scales, right? And it really helps to think that, there's so many overlaps between nature and culture and land at so many levels, and so many things we take for granted but actually really need to be thought through. So I think a couple of the terms that stuck are binaries, of course. To me, binary is not oppositional, but it's more of lack of something, I guess, in the others. Probably how I'd like to look at a binary. And the other thing is about what Mohan said about, and even Varna and Rajesh, in talking about practice and theory, the challenges of maybe the hurdles, practical hurdles of government, government kind of not letting us do our thing, and then our own prejudices or our OCDs that we have as professionals, and these boundaries that we create between, a part of this whole symposium was that then to kind of question those boundaries between disciplines, they're self-created in many cases. So I think my question is more, since we are in a teaching place, at what point do we actually introduce landscape or nature? Should it be one more actor in the whole set of actors because communities, government, the professional, and how do you kind of integrate landscape into the whole process of teaching and not make it something that we act upon, but something that informs us, where nature is also, landscape is also an actor in the classroom. I think it's something we don't talk about, and like my colleague Shalini, she talks about how it's confetti, that's how they drop some greening in the end like confetti in their drawings, right? Many people do that. So how do we avoid that and make it a more meaningful actor in the whole thing? That was part of having an architect and landscape architect coming together in this panel, because every time we build something, we have to remove something from the land, right? We take something out of the landscape. So then how does
this one it works? I mean, I think it's a good question, and I think that the starting point of a project, need not be solely sort of architectural program driven. There are many ways you can solve an architectural program. Many configurations that could work. You can make a linear building, you can make a building with a courtyard, you can make a tower, you can make a spiral or whatever, But is there something else that would help you choose whether to do an L or a line or a series of dots? So that's where I think landscape can preempt the architecture, And I'll give you a small example. This is this project we didn't talk about today, which we're doing in Patna in Bihar, and the site was actually a very low area which gets flooded, And what we had to design it was a science museum, a very large science museum on a 20-acre site, So the thing was, the starting point of the museum itself is a very complex program. It's about a 3.5 lakh square feet building with a lot of intensity in terms of your engineering services. It's a very intense program in itself. But for us, actually, the question was at that point, how do you occupy a land which in a sort of monsoon kind of landscape? So what is the solution? So then this whole thing of finding a solution which so we were really looking at a solution which would be an example for building in a flood-prone city, which is in a larger terrain of a monsoonal area. And so then the value, and this is all from landscape, of low ground, and like your pond in that village, you need the pond even though it's dry maybe most of the year. So the value of having low ground and being able to retain water, in the site was so the initial sketch of the project came from actually an understanding of how you would manage water, and there could have been many ways the museum could have been solved, but that became the sort of driving force, and then the architecture adjusted itself to that. So actually there's no reason why, and I would really say that there are very strong arguments to sort of support that approach, I would say, and that's the reason why what the question you're asking is, I think, quite relevant, and that probably those issues should be taken up. But maybe I don't know how specifically you would think that all you all are doing it. I'm not sure.
If I can just add to that, I think this is also a very specific Anglo-Saxon problem. I've worked with and continue to teach in different geographies. I do not have this conflict if I'm speaking, doing it in a Spanish or a Francophone part of the world. Not necessarily Europe. Could be Latin America, could be Central Africa. Because the pedagogy itself is much more mature and fluid. I think, and I know this is a very wrong and offensive thing to say, but a lot of the Anglo-Saxon imaginations of architecture is still stuck in the Bauhaus period. We have just not moved on from there. Architect as the master of the universe, the object as the ultimate desire, and nothing has changed. We may have moved on from concrete into a look-about. Beyond that, there has really been no essential change in the approach of the profession, and that is very much apparent in our pedagogy, in the way our syllabus is structured. I'm not even talking of the Indian ones, where you will be surprised to know that landscape is not even seen as a specialization in South America, because that is inherently what you do as spatial designers, which is very different from other places. If you're working with a francophone country, whether it's in France or Senegal or Mali, any of these aspects, whether it's urban planning, whether it's landscape, whether it's building material, whether it's community engagement or legal framework, is very much inherent. It's not this added on thing that you do at the end to get one elective going. And I think that needs a very, very essential rethinking of what our role is. This is not to say something is better or worse. If my role, I see it as an interior designer, I don't need to deal with flood-prone areas. But as an architect, if I'm actually shaping that land, I should be aware and sensitive to that aspect.
Yes, I feel really, sort of introducing landscape more as an approach or a thought process, from the beginning, and having professors like Rajesh sir and Mohan sir. I think that's how my exposure to landscape was widened, and sort of really basing studios, like you said, Devarakadu becoming a studio, sort of sensitizing you to an environment. And in Sri Lanka, your first semester, your first entire year is about experiencing architecture. And this is a country very close to ours. So, and there is no distinction made between how you experience architecture. So whether it's through the perspective of the environment or cultural history, it's still a part of how you approach design. So if there's a way in which it could be more about approaches and thinking and sort of being guided in that way, I think it would be more fruitful.
Good morning. My question was again added to what Sailama was asking about her approach to teaching. When it comes to students, we do want to integrate landscape as an element of the design itself, but then when we start it just becomes like buildings, and then it becomes like an afterthought as a structure. So how do we go about it? And also the fact that when you think of landscape, it becomes more like an exterior element, right? So you do have to give enclosures with property of safety and other stuff. So how do we integrate it into the structure? This is also coming from the fact that we are doing interior design and we want to integrate nature into the building itself. Yeah.
Deliverables.
I think it's a very good question, because if you look at it, if you put it as a spectrum, there's interior, the elements which are like furniture or products, then you have architecture, landscape, so it starts getting bigger and bigger. But I would say, it's a combination of both your questions. I think that the first thing is you have to learn to see, okay? And if you see and you appreciate, then it will come out by itself, okay, in your projects, So I think that if you sit in Bangalore and you don't see good architecture, you don't see good, you don't see inspiring environments, built
environments. I think then, because the moment you see that, then it stays with you, and then it comes out at some point. And so you see something good. First is you see it and you say, wow, I feel really good. I'm entering this building. I don't know why. My heart is beating faster, and I feel like bugging the columns or something like that. And then you get very excited, and then you go back and then you think about it. And why did I feel so good in that place? And then you need to study that building. So then you go and you measure it and you understand it, you draw the plans, and then you say, okay, this was there, or this is interesting about it, which I didn't notice. So you try to understand why you enjoyed it. So similarly with the landscape, I think you have to go out and see things, and and you need to like they say also almost have a farmer's eye, to see subtle things, like how land is modified, how they're beautiful. When you just drive around, you just drive out of the city and you go out into, and it's a feast for the eyes. So when you start looking at these things, then you absorb them, and then it becomes part of then when you're building, it's not that you're thinking only about that last structure which comes. You're also thinking about how the entire thing works together, and probably maybe studio projects to encourage students to go out and besides, and actually look at places and because I think to recognize and see is the first step. If you can't see, then you can't make also, so you can't distinguish what is a very mundane or boring between that and something which is special. Then you cannot make it either, so I think maybe that part of travel and looking at things is very important. I think as part of our, and then produce something out of it. It's not that you just go and have fun and then don't do anything after that.
You stop it. Other questions? You have a question.
Good morning. My question is with respect to water landscape. There is a system of channels called Rajakaluways, and they were all strongly interlinked. And this system existed in the past. But now, unfortunately, this system, this linkage is lost due to encroachments and anthropogenic activities. So, how to get back these linkages, which is the root cause of urban floods as well. So, how to get back these linkages? What is your take on these issues?
It's true that many of these linkages are destroyed, but I would encourage you to step back and ask larger questions, because if we actually fixate on Rajakaluwe fragmentation being a problem, we try to fix it, we lose sight of other things. Is it to do with the natural capacity of the city region, and is that recognized in our urban planning processes? Does the master plan even recognize the topography, or are we working on a flat piece of paper? These are very core issues, because when you actually see a plan made, it actually reads as a pattern. It actually doesn't speak to the land. Look at any of our cities' master plans. We have what is the so-called as the green belt, which is cutting across the topography irrespective of the geography, whereas it would have made 100 times more sense instead of having green belts if you had green ribbons that run through Bangalore, because it would at least reflect the reality of the ground. So many of these are actually embedded in the very core thinking of what drives these processes. I would rather start addressing the issue from there rather than trying to fix the pipe end of the problem, which would essentially be more like band-aid solutions. I may fix the solution, I may create the linkage. I still haven't understood anything about decentralized ways of managing water. Why would I pump water from 150 kilometers and then pump out the sewage again 100 kilometers? This is what is causing flooding. It's not that climate change has happened day before yesterday to cause the flooding. So, and these are also systemic problems that will only grow with time. It's not like I built a colony here and tomorrow it gets flooded. It means the time span between an action and its impact can be decades, because the whole urban ecology itself is quite complex. So I would actually step back and try and address some very essential questions on what frames the development narrative, what frames urbanization and things, before I look at technical or technological solutions.
I would just like to add on here. I was taking first year design studio, so where we have asked students to make a space for an artist to display their arts. So they have to select a site of their own. So now students have come with a site which was a flood prone area. So I directly went to the student and said, "Oh, it's a flood prone area, you can't take it." So she told me, and then I started to rethink on what I said. She told, "Ma'am, why do we treat a flood prone area as a problem? Why can't we build over it? Or why can't we rethink architecture in such a manner where we can just coexist with it?" So that's it.
I would like to thank the respected panelists for this very intriguing and interesting discussion. I would like to thank Meera ma'am to bring all the talks together, and definitely all of the participants who asked the question. It is actually the intent of this symposium to get the dialogue going between the experts and the students as well as the researchers.